at the age of 19, not 6 and 9. But I deliberately kept that as a last point because it could be debatable, which one is more accurate historically. But it is a very powerful evidence because Ibn Ishaq, in the opinion of scholars of hadith, is a dependable person. Some people criticize him, but people, including Imam Ahmad, one of the leaders of one of the 4 schools of jurisprudence, consider him to be a dependable source of hadith. Not that he's infallible, but he is a dependable source as well. Finally, the last one. Some people basically say that the Prophet married the divorcee of his son. Her name was Zainab, and his son's name was Zayd. And not only this, they keep adding some fixing based on some unauthentic reports that appear in some histories, and add their own caveat to that, more or less giving the reader the impression that the Prophet really wanted to marry Zainab, and somehow Zayd knew that the Prophet wanted to marry Zainab even though she was married to him, so he had to divorce her so that she can observe her waiting period and then to marry her. Relax, I got the notice that I have 5 minutes, but I promise I try to finish within that. Khalas, no problem. Okay, to answer, of course, that might give some kind of question, even not only of obsession with women, it might even raise some serious moral question, to really aspire to marry a woman, who's already married, even if the person voluntarily divorced her, it's a very uncomfortable kind of situation, right? Is it? In order to answer that question historically, we have to ask, who was Zayd? Who was Zainab? How did Zainab come to marry Zayd? And what happened in their marriage? And why the Prophet finally was commanded to marry her? First, who was Zayd? Zayd was not the son of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And you heard Sheikh Faisal reading the first ayah, مَا كَانَ مُحَمَّدٌ أَبَا أَحَدٍ مِّن رِجَالِكُمْ. He was not his biological son. But in Arabia, before it was outlawed in the Quran, the adoption was used, and that Zayd actually was a slave that the Prophet freed and said, he is my son, meaning adopted son. But he was not his biological son. Question, who was Zainab? And did the Prophet really discover her beauty all of a sudden and wanted to marry her? Many people do not realize that Zainab is the cousin of the Prophet. And they grew together as children. And he have seen her before even hijab was prescribed later in Medina. How come all of a sudden, after all these years being raised together, discovered that Zainab is beautiful? Thirdly, how did Zainab get to marry Zayd? It was actually by some pressure applied to her by the Prophet, because he wanted to cancel this aristocracy. Zainab was coming from the elite tribe of Quraysh. Zayd was a former slave. But the Prophet wanted to make a good point that you look for the character of the person. So she accepted to marry Zayd. But then, what happened in their marriage? Problems. Zayd comes to complain to the Prophet that his wife is treating him, in a way that's too haughty, that they're not getting along. So the Prophet, like any good marriage counselor, would say, be patient. But then something very crucial, and that is actually found in Surah 33. People use their imagination without reading the Quran, which is the most authentic source of seerah. Revelation come to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, through Gabriel, to tell him, look, ultimately, Zayd is going to divorce Zainab. This marriage is not going to last. Secondly, confidential information, revelation given to him, that after Zayd divorces Zainab, God will command you to marry her after she observed the waiting period, required waiting period, to marry her in order to break the taboo in Arabia that the adopted child is exactly the same like a biological son. And the Prophet keeps this information. He's not authorized to reveal it yet. So Zayd comes back to the Prophet again and complain, our marital life is on the rocks, But then the Prophet, knowing even that he will end up divorcing his wife, again, as any good counselor would say, as the Quran says, أَمْسِكْ عَلَيْكَ زَوْجَكَ وَاتَّقِ اللَّهَ, keep your wife and fear Allah. And he hides, as the Quran says, you hide in yourself what Allah is going to reveal. What was the Prophet hiding? The Prophet was hiding the information that ultimately he will be commanded to marry her. And that's why the Quran says, don't fear people, it's okay. Don't fear people. If Allah commands you, he is not your biological son. I know it was very difficult on the Prophet. That's why the Quran says, you fear people, you should fear Allah alone. Because nobody could break that taboo. You know, when you say this is my adopted son, it has three implications. One, he takes your name, so there is a false identity. Two, he inherits on equal footing with your biological children. Three, he becomes exactly your biological son, which means if he's married, his wife becomes your daughter-in-law, and if he divorces her, it would be incest to get married to her. But the Quran came to say this is false. Zayd is a stranger. He is not of even the tribe of the Prophet. He is not his son. And as such, that taboo has to be broken. That was the story. It is found very clearly and explicitly stated in the Quran. Now, to conclude, my basic appeal here for both Muslims and their non-Muslim brethren is to try and be objective. Try not to get influence from people who don't know what they're talking about, who have their own agenda in the media or otherwise. And even for Muslims themselves, unfortunately, sometimes again, Islamic education is not really that sufficient to be aware of some of those issues and problems. I'm very glad and thankful to you all that I was afforded an opportunity last year to address a similarly controversial issue of the nature of relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims, and verses that has been misinterpreted by one party or the other, or sometimes both. I think it is this kind of objective, honest search for truth, not a partisan or aggressive or antagonistic approach, that would lead us all to better understanding, better appreciation, and after all, achieving more peaceful and respectful coexistence amongst ourselves. Thank you very much for your patience. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much indeed, Jazakallah, Dr. Badawi, for your most enlightening and most informative lecture. No doubt there will be questions raised at the appropriate time. And if there are any questions on Qadr, predestination of fate, please come forward after the meeting finishes or after the lectures finish. Brothers and sisters, the purpose and the objective of organizing these lectures is to educate ourselves, to equip ourselves with knowledge so that we can then disseminate information, pass it on, and also use it as a defense against the onslaught towards Islam. Now, if you were to join the National Dawah program of IPCI, you will be handed out these leaflets. We have to learn to capitalize on the adverse publicity in the media against Islam. For instance, this onslaught against Islam is nothing new. As Dr. Badawi quite correctly pointed out, it started from the days of the Qurayshite when Walid bin al-Mughira, he suggested that